Never spoken to kindly in 23 years. A Lakota chief said her name, and she wept. The name on the deed said Marin Voss. I found that out later. The morning I first saw her, she was just a woman standing in the yard of the burned-out Callaway place, one hand on the scorched gate post and the other shading her eyes against the sun. She wasn't looking at the ruin. She was looking past it, across the flats, at the line where the grass goes silver before it meets the sky, like she was deciding something. My name is Lakota Whitehorse. I was chief of the Sikingu band by then for 11 years running, and before that I'd ridden with my father for 7 more. I was 44 years old and I hadn't said anything soft to another person since my wife Chasina went into the ground with our son still inside her. That was 23 years before the morning I'm telling you about. I don't count every year of it. I just know it was 23, because that's how it felt, like a number you carry in your back the way some men carry old iron. I wasn't supposed to be riding that far south alone. My second, a man named Runs Close, had told me that morning that the Harker outfit was pushing their fence line again, and that I ought to take 4 men when I went to look. I told him I'd take none. He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with me about certain things the same year I stopped softening my voice. The burn place had been empty 6 weeks. Some trouble between cattlemen, not my trouble, though the fire had crept close enough to the good grass that I'd come to check on it twice. I didn't expect anyone to be there. She heard my horse before she turned. I saw her shoulders settle, not flinch, the way someone settles who has already decided they're not afraid, who has made that choice ahead of time and is committed to it. She turned slow and looked straight at me. She was maybe 40, a big-boned woman, not soft, pale blue eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set hard for a long time, dress that had been washed enough to go gray, boots that fit like they belonged to her and not to someone she'd borrowed them from. She had a rifle standing against the gate post, barrel up, and she left it there. Didn't reach for it, didn't step away from it, just let it stand. She said, "This your land?" I said, "No." She said, "Mine neither, yet." That was all for a while. My horse moved and I let him, and she watched me without the kind of watching that's really waiting for you to go away. It was more like she was just accounting for me, settling what I was into some order in her head. "Callaway owe you?" I asked her. "No, Callaway's in Cheyenne. This place is going up for back taxes in 3 weeks. She said it plain, no color in it. "I'm here to see if there's enough left to bother." "There isn't," I said. She looked at the burned shell of the house. What remained was 2 walls and the chimney and a lot of black timber. She said, "No, there probably isn't." Then she looked back at me. "You know this land better than Callaway did." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile. "I expect so." I rode on. I don't know why I looked back. I'm not a man who looks back. But when I got to the rise I turned and she was back the way I'd found her, hand on the gatepost, looking past the ruin at the long silver line of the grass, still deciding. She bought the land. I found that out from Runs Close, who found it out from the trading post at Willow Creek, where she'd gone to register the deed. Marin Voss, widow out of eastern Nebraska, sold her 40 acres there after her husband died and came west with the money and a wagon and, Runs Close said with some amusement, a milk cow she'd tied to the wagon's tailgate. "What does she mean to do with it?" I asked. He shrugged. "Run cattle, they're saying. Couple of men from Harker's offered to buy her out already." She said no. Already? She hadn't been there a week. I thought about the set of her jaw. No, I thought she'd say no. The Harker outfit was the main trouble in that corner of the territory that year. Tom Harker was the kind of man who'd grown up with enough money that he'd never learned there was any version of the world in which other people didn't eventually give way to him. He was 40-something, thickening at the belt, and he had 7 armed riders on his payroll who weren't cowhands, whatever he called them. My people had 3 grievances with Harker that I was holding in reserve for when the right moment came to press them with the Indian agent in Laramie. I'd been patient about it. Patience is something I have in a quantity that has at times frightened people who were watching me be patient. I didn't interfere with whatever Maren Voss was doing on her burned land. I had no reason to. I rode past the Calloway place twice in the first week after she took the deed, and both times I saw her working, once pulling charred wood out of the house frame, stacking what could be salvaged, burning the rest in a separate pile well away from the grass, once digging, though I was too far off to see what for. She didn't look up either time. I don't know if she saw me. I think she did. On the 10th or 11th day I came by in the late afternoon, and there was a wall up. One new wall, raw lumber, set into the old foundation where the original south wall had been. She'd done it herself. You could tell because the boards weren't perfectly plumb, but they were close, and the corner bracing was solid. Someone had taught her, or she'd figured it out, or both. She was on the roof of what remained of the original north wall, fitting a new beam across the gap to where her new wall rose. I stopped at the gate. She looked down. "That span's too long for one person," I said. She looked at the beam, she looked at me. "I've got a block and tackle. You'll be up there till dark." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Get down off your horse." So I did. We didn't talk much while we worked. She knew what she was doing well enough, and I knew construction well enough. And there are jobs where two people who don't know each other can still fall into a rhythm if neither of them is trying to be in charge of the other. We got the beam seated before the light went. She climbed down and looked at it from the yard, and I could see her deciding again, this time whether it was good. She decided it was. She went inside the standing part of the structure. She'd set up a sleeping area in the corner of the surviving room, a bedroll and a crate and a lantern, and came back out with 2 tin cups and a coffee pot. She poured without asking if I wanted any. I took the cup. The coffee was very strong and slightly burnt, and it was the best thing I'd tasted in recent memory because I hadn't expected it. We sat on the old fence rail at the east side of the yard and drank it while the light went flat and the first cool came off the grass. The milk cow she'd staked out by the creek made a sound once, satisfied with something, and then was quiet. She said, "Harker's men came by yesterday." "How many?" "2. Told me the land was disputed, and I ought to talk to Mr. Harker before I put any more work into it." "It's not disputed." "I know it's not." She drank her coffee. "I told them that." "What did they say?" "The taller one said I might want to reconsider my tone." She said it without any particular feeling. I told him my tone was the only thing about the situation I was certain of. I looked at her. She was looking at the half-rebuilt house. "They'll come back," I said. "I expect so." "What will you do?" She turned then and looked at me straight, the way she'd done that first morning. "I don't know yet. What do you think I should do?" It was not a helpless question. It was the question of someone who is genuinely gathering information, who does not mistake gathering information for weakness. I said, "What does the rifle shoot?" .4440. "How well?" "Well enough, a beat, better at distance." I thought about the lay of the land, the long sight lines across the flats. I thought about Tom Harker, who was the kind of man who didn't like to do his own dirty work when he was being watched. I said, "There's a rise 300 yards east-northeast. If you're ever going to need that rifle, you want to have been to that rise first. You want to know the drop." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll go tomorrow morning." That was all. We finished the coffee. I got on my horse and rode back north toward my own camp in the hill country, and the dark came in behind me the way it does out there, not all at once, but like a tide, filling the low places first. 3 things happened in the following 2 weeks. The first was that Runs Close told me Harker had sent a man to the land agent in Willow Creek asking about irregularities in the Voss deed. There weren't any. The agent was a fair man and he said so. The second was that I found a gap in our boundary fence on the south end, near the creek crossing, cut clean, not broken, cut, and 3 of Harker's cattle on our grass. I had the cattle driven back and the fence mended, and I said nothing about it publicly. I recorded it. I added it to the other grievances in the ledger I kept in my head. The third was that I rode past the Calloway place one evening and the house was half rebuilt. Not more than half, but solidly half, 2 full walls and the beginnings of a third, a proper sill laid, a window opening framed in. She'd gotten the door hung on the standing original wall and it had a crossbar on it. I didn't stop that evening, but I saw the lantern lit inside. I want to be honest with you about something, and it's not easy to say because I am not a man who has spent much time thinking about what I wanted, at least not in the sense I mean here. I had wanted things, good grass, clean water, fair treatment, safety for my people, enough ammunition, a good horse. I wanted those things and I worked for them and I was clear about them. But there is a different kind of wanting, and I had not known it in 23 years, and I did not trust it, and I did not look at it straight. I just knew that when I saw the lantern lit in that window, I did not ride on immediately. I sat on my horse in the dark outside her fence line for maybe a minute, which is a long time to sit still and not know exactly why you're doing it. Then I rode on. Runs Close figured it out before I did. He's always been quick that way. He came to me one morning about 3 weeks after I'd helped Maren Voss with her roof beam, and he said, without any leading up to it, "The widow is in trouble." I looked up from the hoof I was cleaning on my gray gelding. What kind? Harker's men ran her cattle off the north pasture night before last. She had 8 head, they're gone. He paused. She went to the marshal at Willow Creek. He told her he'd look into it. I knew what that meant. The marshal at Willow Creek and Tom Harker had a history that ran back far enough that the marshals looking into things generally resulted in nothing being found. She know that? I asked. I think she's beginning to. I set down the hoof. I stood up. What else? One of my cousins was at the trading post when she came in. She asked about you. About me. Asked who you were, your name, whether you were. He stopped, and I saw something pass across his face that might have been amusement and might have been something else. Whether you were a man she could trust. I didn't say anything to that. My cousin told her yes, Runs Close said. I picked up the hoof again. Tell me if anything else moves. 2 days later I rode to her place in the late morning. The yard was quiet. The door was open. I called her name, her first name, Maren, which I'd spoken once to myself to know how it sat in my mouth, and which I had not said to another person, and she came to the door and looked out. I said, I heard about your cattle. She stood in the doorway. She looked tired in a way that was new, not bone-tired the way you get from hard work, but the other kind, the kind that comes from being pushed at without being able to push back. She had that look, but the set of her jaw was the same. 8 head, she said. That was most of what I had. I know. She was quiet. I said, I have a matter with Harker. I've been patient about it. I don't intend to be patient much longer. I paused. If you're willing to say what happened to you in front of the land agent and 2 men I'll name, and willing to let me add it to what I'm bringing to the federal agent in Laramie, you'll have standing in what comes of it. Your word alongside mine and my men's. She looked at me for a long moment. What do you expect to come of it? I expect Harker to be fenced in. Not jailed, he's got too much money to be jailed. But fenced. No more moving fence lines, no more runoff cattle, no more men visiting widows with suggestions about tone. You've been building this case. For some time. Something in her face shifted, not the tired thing that was still there, something behind it. She said, you came by that first morning, before I had the deed. Yes. You've ridden past since. Yes. You've been watching. I could have said I was watching the land. It was true enough that I was watching the land, but that would have been the smaller answer, and she was someone who deserved the full one. I said, I have. She looked down at her boots. She pressed her lips together once. Then she said, all right, I'll say what happened. I nodded. I started to pull my horse around. She said, Lakota. I looked back. She said, thank you for coming. It was a plain thing to say, a simple thing. She said it straight, looking at me straight, and there was nothing complicated in it. It was just true, and she said it the way she did everything, without decoration, just the honest weight of it. But I want you to understand something. 23 years is a long time. 23 years of being the man other men brought their trouble to. The man who held the line and set the terms and decided the hard things, and was never the man anyone thought to say thank you to except in the formal way, the obligated way, the way you thank someone because it would be rude not to. This was not that. This was a woman looking at me and meaning it. I didn't know what to do with it. I just said yes and rode out. But my hands weren't quite right on the reins for a mile or two. The meeting at the land agent's office in Willow Creek happened on a Wednesday. I brought runs close and a man named Stony Bear, who was older than both of us and whose word was considered by everyone in that territory, including most white men, to be as reliable as written record. Maren Voss came alone. She dressed carefully, not formally, but carefully, which is different. The same gray dress, but her hair was pinned and she'd cleaned her boots. She told what happened plainly. No embellishment, no fury, no tears. 8 head of cattle, the North Pasture, the night of the 14th. She named the brand on Harker's cattle that had replaced hers on the grass 2 mornings later. She said she'd seen 2 of Harker's riders at a distance. The land agent wrote it down. I laid out the fence violations, the 3 cattle incidents before this one, a statement about a fire on the creek grass that had never been properly investigated. Stony Bear told about a conversation he'd had with Harker's foreman, which I won't repeat here except to say it was the kind of conversation that tends to look bad when it's written down in an official document. The land agent, his name was Prentice, and he was a careful, reasonable man, thanked us all, and said he would forward everything to the federal agent in Laramie. He looked at Harker's name written in his ledger and then looked at me and said, "This is a significant body of evidence, Chief Whitehorse." I said I intended it to be. Outside on the board sidewalk, Maren Voss stood in the noon light and said to me, "Will it work?" "It will work," I said. "Not today, maybe not for 2 months, but Harker is not big enough to fight the federal government and he knows it. He'll pull back. And my cattle. You'll be compensated. I'll make sure that's part of the agreement." She nodded. She looked down the street. She said, "I've been on that land 63 days. I've put most of what I had into it." "I know. I don't usually," she stopped, started again. "I don't usually ask for help." "No," I said, "you don't." She looked at me then. The noon light was harsh and she didn't squint against it. She just looked. And there was something in that look that I had to work not to look away from, not because it was hard to see, but because it was the opposite, because it was the kind of regard that feels like it's measuring what you actually are and finding it sufficient, and I was not accustomed to that and did not entirely know how to hold still under it. She said, "You're a good man, Lakota Whitehorse. I have been called many things, capable, formidable, dangerous, reliable. I have been called a good chief, which is a different thing from what she said. I have been called stubborn by men who meant it as criticism and by my father who meant it as praise. I have not been called, by a woman who was looking at me without obligation or fear or any motive I could name except honesty, I have not been called a good man. Not in 23 years. Not since Chassana, who used to say it the way Maren Voss said it, like it was just a fact she was reporting. I said, "You should eat something before you ride back." She looked at me one more moment, and then one corner of her mouth moved, the closest she came to a smile, which was very close, and she said, "Yes, I should." We ate at the small place next to the grain merchant. She had beef and bread and I had the same. We didn't talk much, but it wasn't the silence of having nothing to say. It was a different kind, a better kind. Harker pulled back in 6 weeks. Prentice had sent the full record to Laramie, and within a month there was a federal surveyor at his fence line, and a letter that I never read but whose effect I could see in the way Harker's riders stopped appearing on the south grass. Maren Voss got her cattle back, not her 8, but 8 head of equivalent value from Harker's own stock, which was part of the agreement reached without Harker's enthusiasm, but with his eventual compliance. I heard about it from Prentice. I didn't go to the Callaway place that week. I didn't go the next week either. I was aware, in the way you are aware of a stone in your boot that you've decided to walk with, that I was doing a thing I didn't usually do, which is avoid. I had an old habit, after Chasena, of not letting anything get close enough to cause trouble, and that habit had served me for a long time, and I wasn't sure I trusted myself to put it down. I had held a great many things at the length I'd learned to hold them. I did not know how to hold this one differently, and I was not sure I should. Runs Close said nothing. He watched me avoid for 2 weeks and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. On the 17th day I went. She was in the yard. She'd gotten a second cow by then, and both of them were in the small pasture she'd fenced on the east side. The house was finished, not grand, not even especially handsome, but complete. All 4 walls, a good roof, a proper door, 2 window openings with shutters she'd cut and hung herself, the fit slightly imperfect but the hang solid. She'd planted something in 2 rows near the south wall, low and green. She saw me coming, and she stood and waited. I dismounted at the gate. I stood there with my reins in my hand, and I looked at the house, and there was a thing happening in my chest that I had no good word for. Pride wasn't the right word, because it wasn't my house. Satisfaction wasn't it either. It was more like recognition, like seeing that a thing you'd half believed could exist actually did. "You finished it," I said. "I finished it," she paused. "Come in and see." I followed her inside. It was spare and clean, and she'd built a proper hearth in the far corner, stone she'd hauled herself from the creek bed, a table and 2 chairs, a shelf with 4 books and a tin with coffee on it, and a small wooden box that was, I thought, probably the most personal thing in the room and was none of my business. The window that faced south let in a rectangle of afternoon light that fell across the plank floor in a way that made the room seem larger than it was. I stood in that room and I felt something I want to try to say straight because it matters. I felt that this was a place where I could rest. Not sleep rest, the other kind, the kind I hadn't done in a long time. And that feeling was so unfamiliar that it frightened me a little, which is an odd thing for a man like me to admit, but I am telling you what happened. She poured coffee. She handed me the cup, and her hand was steady and so was mine, and for a moment we were close in the small space of the room and neither of us moved back from it. I said Maren. Just that, just her name. I don't know entirely what I meant to say after it. Something about being glad the house was done. Something about the cattle being returned. Some reasonable, composed, arm's-length thing that I would have then put back behind the wall I'd kept things behind for 23 years. But she heard her name in my mouth, and something happened to her face that I was not prepared for. Her eyes filled. Not crying. She didn't cry. Her jaw was the same and she was still standing straight and she didn't make a sound. But her eyes filled and she turned her face a little to the side, not to hide it, too late for that, but just as a reflex, the way your hand comes up to a light that's sudden. I said, "What is it?" She shook her head once, pressed her lips together. Then she said very quietly, "It's nothing." "Maren," I said it again the same way, without thinking about it. She let out a breath. She said, "My husband called me Mrs. Voss. My brothers called me by my father's name for me, which I didn't like. The hands we had in Nebraska, the ones who were kind, they didn't call me anything at all, just said ma'am." She stopped. I haven't heard my own name said like, she stopped again. Like it was something worth saying. 23 years. I had been carrying mine. She had been carrying hers. I don't know what I looked like standing in her kitchen holding a tin cup of coffee, but whatever I looked like, it was probably the truth of what I was, which was a man who had held everything at arm's length for long enough that he'd forgotten what his arms were for. I set the coffee down on her table. I stood in front of her and I looked at her face, the jaw and the pale eyes and the tears that were there and not spilling, and I said her name a third time. Marin. And she turned back and she looked at me, and she did the thing that I will not forget as long as I have years left to carry it. She reached up and she put her hand against the side of my face. Just her palm, rough from the work she'd done, warm from the coffee cup she'd been holding. She put it there and she looked at me like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to see and had stopped looking for a long time ago. I put my hand over hers. I held it there. We stood in her finished house in the afternoon light that came through the south window, and neither of us spoke for a while. The cow outside made a sound. The coffee sat on the table getting cold. Runs Close saw the difference in me when I rode back to camp that evening. He didn't say anything about it. He just handed me a piece of dried meat and sat down next to me at the fire and didn't look at me sideways, which is the thing about Runs Close. He knows when something is happening and he respects it. I sat at the fire a long time that night, not thinking exactly, more like letting it settle. Like when you've been carrying a stone for so long that you've built a gate around it, and then you put it down, and you have to learn again what your real walk is. The following weeks went like this. I came to her land maybe twice in 10 days, sometimes to help with something. She was building a proper barn, which was a bigger project, and there was real work to be done, and sometimes for no stated reason. She made coffee. We sat on the fence rail sometimes, or inside when the evenings turned cold. She was not a woman who needed to fill silence, and neither was I, and so the silences weren't uncomfortable. They were just time passing between two people who were getting used to the particular quality of each other's company. She told me about Nebraska. The husband, Geld Voss, who had been a decent enough man but not a warm one, who had died of a lung sickness that took him in 3 months and left her with 40 acres and no children, and a feeling she described as not grief exactly, but a long gray flatness that she'd tried to outrun by coming west. I told her about Chasana, not the whole of it, some things you hold back not from secrecy but because they're yours, and sharing them whole would be like giving away something that still has a use. But enough. The pregnancy. The way it happened. The 11 years after, where I became exactly the kind of chief my people needed, and exactly the kind of man who is necessary, and relied on and not known. She listened without trying to fix anything, which was the right way to listen. She didn't say I'm sorry in the empty way people do. She said, she sounds like someone I would have liked to know. That was exactly right. That was the honest answer. I told her what my name meant. Lakota, friend to everyone or ally to all, depending on how you render it. She thought about that and then she said, you're not particularly, are you, an ally to everyone? I said, no, it's more of an aspiration. And then something happened that hadn't happened to me in a long time, which was that I laughed. Just a small thing. But real. She smiled at that, the full one this time, not just the corner of her mouth, and the afternoon light was in her eyes and her jaw was still the same, set and strong, but the set of it was different now. Easier. Like something that had been braced for a blow that wasn't coming anymore. The barn frame went up on a Saturday. I brought Runs Close and 2 younger men from my camp. She made enough food for 10 people, which turned out to be about right because Stony Bear's nephew and a couple of others showed up before noon when the word got out there was work and a meal. It was the kind of day that happens sometimes and can't really be planned, a real day, where the work was hard and the food was good, and the light lasted long, and the thing being built was solid and necessary and real. At the end of it, when most of the others had ridden out, Run's clothes found a reason to check on something at the far end of the property. He is a tactful man. Marin and I stood in the yard in the blue end of the day and looked at the frame of what would be her barn. It was good work. The uprights were plumb and the crossbeams were solid, and the whole thing stood against the evening sky like it intended to be there for 50 years. She said I couldn't have done this. No, I said, not alone. I mean any of it, the federal case, the cattle. She paused. Any of it. I looked at her. You'd have found a way. Maybe, eventually. She looked at me. I'm glad I didn't have to. I want to say something here that is true and that I don't know how to make sound the way it felt, which is the problem with trying to tell the truth of a thing in words. The words are never quite the size of it. What I felt standing there was not triumph. It was not even happiness in the way I'd have described it before. It was more like, it was like being a door that has been stuck and cold for a long time, and something warm coming through it. Something coming through and continuing through, not stopping at the threshold. I said, come here. She came. She stepped into me and I put my arms around her and she put her face against my neck, and she let out a breath that I think she'd been holding for years. Maybe 23 years. Maybe longer. And I held her in the yard of her finished place as the last light fell down behind the hills, and I felt what a man feels when he is standing in the right place, doing the right thing with the right person, after a long time of being useful and alone. That is all it was. That is everything it was. Here is where I am now. Her name is Marin Whitehorse. We married in the spring, at the land agent's office in Willow Creek, because the nearest minister was 2 days' ride, and she said she didn't need a man reading words over her, that she could read herself, which I respected. Prentice was the witness. He seemed pleased about it in a way that made me think he'd known it was coming before we had. Her house and my hill camp are 12 miles apart, which is a day's easy ride. I move between them. My people understand this in the way they understand most things about me, which is without comment, and with the understanding that my judgment about my own life is as reliable as my judgment about everything else. Runs close still runs most of the daily things and has for years, and is better at it than he'd ever admit. She is still the hardest-jawed woman I have ever known. She is still someone you would not want to argue with about anything she'd already decided, because she decides carefully and then does not move. She still makes the strong burnt coffee, and she will not apologize for it. Last fall she shot a coyote at 230 yards that had been taking her chickens, and she did it from exactly the rise I'd told her about in the first week, and she came back in the door and told me about it with a satisfaction that I found unreasonably pleasant. She says my name the way she said it that first time in the house. Not frequently. She doesn't do anything frequently that doesn't need to be. But when she says it like she means it, and that's the thing, that's the whole thing, really. That someone says your name like they mean it. Like you are a particular, known, specific person, and not a function or a title or a problem to be managed. Like you are a man and she is a woman, and she picked you on purpose, with full understanding of what she was picking. 23 years. And then Marin. I don't talk much as a rule. I don't tell my own story to people. But I'm telling you this because it's true, and the truth of it is that a man can go a long time being necessary and never be known, being useful and never being chosen. You can do everything right, hold the line, protect what needs protecting, be the thing other people lean on, and still go to sleep every night with something hollow in the middle of you that you've gotten so used to you've stopped calling it by its name. And then someone says your name. That's all. They say your name like it's worth saying, and they look at you like you're worth looking at, and they put their hand against your face in a finished house in the afternoon light, and after that the hollow thing is just gone. You don't even notice it leave. You just realize one day that you're not carrying it anymore. The barn her son is in right now. She had a son. I should have told you, 14 years old, named Corin, who is the kind of boy who asks every question he can think of and a few that haven't occurred to anyone else yet, and who has been teaching himself Lakota by asking Runs Close to say things to him in it, and then memorizing them, which Runs Close pretends to find exhausting and actually finds delightful. That barn is what we built together. She and I and my men, and whatever other good souls showed up that Saturday. Good work, solid and necessary and built to last. I went back to check on the south fence line this morning, the same fence we've mended twice. It was solid. I rode along it in the early cold with my breath making clouds and the grass going silver where the frost was in it, and it was exactly the kind of morning that used to feel like being the only one out in it. It didn't feel like that this morning. There was smoke already coming from her chimney when I came back over the rise. She'd have the coffee on. It would be too strong and slightly burnt, and I would drink every drop of it. A man can go a long time in the cold. He doesn't have to.